you know, one of the things we wanted to look into, and you came to one of our very first committee meetings, I think it was on your first day on site in August, and the committee obviously wanted to go through and vet out all the options and say, because nobody really wants to shut a golf course down again. And if there was an option to get our greens to match the same performance of 6 and 15 without spending the money and taking the time off the course, we'd obviously prefer that. So we asked you, I think in that meeting, about what else could we do? What are some of those options? And in your report, you know, you talked to and identify, I believe, 4 of them. And I'd like you just to speak about those a little bit and, you know, hopefully give us your candid feedback on what, you know, you can't obviously predict an exact performance outcome, but give us what those options are and also maybe your opinion on what the result will be and the timing to get to that result.
As far as the 4 options, the first option is rebuild all the push-up greens to USGA modified specifications. The second option is to, the club's been aerifying for years, but the organic matter is being built up faster than it's being removed, and this happens at a lot of clubs. But to remove this organic matter, which is causing all the problems, we can do a drill and fill aerifying process. It's a 7-inch diameter aerifier hole, which is very large, a little bit under 1 inch in diameter, but on 8 inches deep on 7.5-foot centers, and do this aggressively to try and remove the organic matter and inject sand into the aerifier holes so the greens will drain better. I don't think the club would ever put up with this process because the holes will take 2 to 3 months to recover before they're completely filled back in, providing unacceptable, bumpy, and untrue and poor putting conditions for a 2 to 3 month period.
Would you have to do that once a year or twice a year, maybe a couple times a year?
And for how long?
Ideally twice a year, spring and fall, and it'll take 10 to 15 years to get all that organic matter out of there. I don't think anybody can put up with it for 1 year or even in the spring or the fall, let alone for 10 to 15 years. So I don't think it's a realistic process, but that's one option the club has. Third option is Dan Dingman has done a great job of, he's applied 4 inches of sand top dressing over his 10-year tenure. And that's helped the surface drainage a little bit. But if there's 2 inches of sand right underneath the turf, then there's this 1 to 2 inches of organic matter layer, the sponge that's holding all the water, and then there's another 2 inches underneath that. And if you want to keep applying sand, it'll take 10 more years to apply 4 more inches, which will give 8 inches of sand. And another 10 years for another 4 inches of sand applied, so to get 12 inches of sand to improve the drainage. But again, it's the organic matter layer is still there, and it's got to be removed. And plus the soils, these push-up soils underneath, drain poorly or they don't drain at all.
And that would be the clay that you have in some of your pictures that we see, or the clay-like organic matter.
Yes, the soil is very inconsistent. It's a clay loam, which doesn't drain. Clay or a clay loam, it's all different colors and inconsistent. The soils drain poorly, and then you have the organic matter layer, the sponge as I call it, that holds water, and it's a no-win situation. The fourth option is the club in 2014 added XGD drainage. It's 2-inch diameter pipe on 6-foot centers in 2014 to all the greens, all 18 regulation, or the non-USGA greens, regulation greens and the putting green. The chipping green was not done, nor was the because it's going to be rebuilt when the driving range is done. It's my understanding. And the Greens Turf Nursery was not done either. The question came up, and by the way, thanks for inviting me to your Greens subcommittee meeting, Reed. That was a great meeting, and your committee asked a lot of great questions. And I really enjoyed that. But adding a 3-inch diameter or 3-inch, putting pipe on 3-foot centers in between the 6-foot centers that exist right now, it's just a Band-Aid. You might get 5% improvement on drainage, but it's not worth the effort. And it's just a Band-Aid, and it's just a waste of money, in my opinion.
So Terry, and I just, so everybody understands, around here, everybody's talking about the XGD drainage, and that's what you just referred to, correct?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
it helps on push-up greens, but because of the poor soil and all the cultural practices that were not done prior to Dan Digman being here. Dan, since he's been here the last 10 years, has done a lot of great things, but you can only do
Terry, how can you tell that?
It's just by, you've got your turf, you got your 2 inches of sand, you got a layer of organic matter that holds water, or if it dries out, it's hard to re-wet it. There's 2-inch layer, and then there's this poor, lousy soil. And the only areas that are very slightly draining are the XGD pipe areas, but they're on 6-foot centers. If you had put them on 3-foot centers, it's just a Band-Aid. It's just not worth the expense and the time.
And you mentioned the 5% maybe improvement than we may get. So
if we had better subsurface, if we had more sandy soils here on our property, that 3-foot centers might make a little bit of a drainage difference, but with our heavier soils and in the clay soils, you're saying it's just not worth the effort to put that in. Is that right?
That's right, correct. Very good point. Yeah, the poor soils and the organic matter layer, those two things are just holding water, and it's just not letting it go through. Now, clubs, other clubs that have had better success with XGD have sandier soils and everything, and they had a lot of good cultural practices done for years and years, but unfortunately, the cultural practices prior to Dan getting here were not done very well, and then plus the organic matter layer and the poor soils, it's just it's a losing situation.
okay, so I guess in the end, your conclusion is, or recommendation would be?
My recommendation is to totally rebuild all the push-up greens to a modified USGA recommendation for the method of putting green construction specifications from the USGA.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The club did a masterful job on number 6 and 15 5 years ago, rebuilding those greens to USGA modified specifications, and they're working perfectly. They drain perfectly. I already mentioned how they were built, and Bruce Hepner did a masterful job. He to restore those greens to Tom Bendelow type design. He used numbers 1, 4, and 17 as an inspiration for the design of 6 and 15 greens, and they're phenomenal. One other thing I'd like to mention, the putting green. The west half of the putting green was designed by Tom Bendelow, and it's got some nice contours in it. The east side was added on in the 60s and 70s. It's pretty flat. So you got two different conditions there from two different architects. Numbers 2, 10, 12, and 13 greens, they're totally out of character with the 12 Tom Bendelow design greens. They're flatter. They're just uncharacteristic. They just don't look like they were designed by Tom Bendelow. Their appearance isn't as good as Tom Bendelow's original 12 greens, the 104-year-old greens. They're flatter, they're uninteresting, and that's another good reason to rebuild all the push-up greens and let Bruce Hebner and Dr. Trey Rogers and Dan Digman, they were the design team for the number 6 and 15 greens, to let them oversee the rebuilding of all the remaining push-up greens, along with having a good accredited golf course contractor.